we continue in Daniel chapter 11 this evening. We left off on Sunday at verse 19. We'll pick up at verse 20 tonight. Hopefully we're going to try to get down through verse 35 this evening.
What chapter again?
What's that?
What chapter again?
11. Now, this whole first half of chapter 11 down through verse 35 is not talking about the Antichrist, the one of the tribulation, but is talking about the various empires and kings that arose during the time of the Greek Empire and then later the Roman Empire, specifically about Antiochus Epiphanes, which we have spent some time in the past discussing. The reason that Daniel spends so much time talking about this particular individual is because he provided the model, or what some theologians refer to as the type. And let me kind of write that out here. I'll make sure that you understand what I'm saying here. Some people refer to this as typology, and it typology, or being a type of something. Why they chose that particular word to call it, I don't know, because probably would have been did I forget something?
No, I needed a pen.
Oh, I had one here on the floor. I think the term model would have been probably a more appropriate term, but since I'm not the big theologian that got to pick that.
Less confusing of a term.
Yeah. But typology, and the reason I even point all this out is because for those of you that do additional studying, or have a commentary and reading it, and you come across something where something refers to as a type of Christ or a type of this, it's not like they're saying, well, this type and that type and this. It's like, if we were to go to the store and say, well, what type did you get? That's not what this means at all. It's not that, I was about to say not that type, but not that particular meaning of the word, but the meaning of the word as in a model of something. And Antiochus Epiphanes was a type of the Antichrist. He set the model. And that's, again, as I mentioned to you on Sunday, the reason that these battles and wars going back and forth between Egypt and Syria with Israel caught in the middle, that's going to actually set the stage and the model, if you will, for what's going to happen during the tribulation period leading up to and including the Battle of Armageddon. One of the things that will take place and I'll give you a little heads up on one of the things we're going to be studying shortly. I agree. It's cold in here.
It's quite comfortable. And I'm
I'll get
wearing
right
shorts.
Well, Brenda's cold, and I'm sitting here directly under that, and I'm cold in here to me. Aunt Tina's always cold. Anyway, there's two big battles that are described in the Bible. One, of course, we know to be Armageddon. Ezekiel 38 and 39 also describes a huge battle. And there's ongoing disagreement among some that say, well, they're describing the same battle. Ezekiel 38 and 39 is talking about Armageddon. There are others that say no, there's going to be an earlier battle, probably around the midpoint of the tribulation, and then there's going to be Armageddon 3.5 years later. And there's points to be said for both views. I tend to think that while I could be convinced otherwise, it does appear that there's going to be two great battles during the tribulation period. One at about the 3.5 year point, which will be pretty much be started, if you will, by the Antichrist desecrating the temple in Israel and breaking the peace covenant. And then, of course, then later, 3 to 3.5 years later, culminating in the Battle of Armageddon. But we'll get into that a little more in detail as we go along. But for now, chapter 11, verse 20. And again, this is speaking of this great leader, said, then in his place, this is the previous leader we left off at, in his place one will arise, who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom, yet within a few days he will be shattered, though neither in anger nor in battle. Now, that's an important point to consider there. That, again, this particular passage is speaking of Antiochus Epiphanes, but if Antiochus Epiphanes is going to be a model for the reign of the Antichrist, this last part of verse 20 is important, because it says that and we know this did in fact happen historically. It's been proven. When Antiochus Epiphanes finally lost his reign over Palestine and Syria, he wasn't defeated in battle. He got run off, and eventually, just through other circumstances, lost his authority. He lost his throne, which of course he never really had a legitimate throne to begin with. And so why this is important is that ultimately the Antichrist is not going to be defeated in battle later on down the line, in yet our future. And says, in fact, it says, notice it here, it says not in anger nor in battle. It won't be political intrigue at all. In fact, we know ultimately the Antichrist will be defeated by the second coming. All right, verse 21 says, in his place a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Now, verse 21 is definitely speaking of Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, the king in verse 20 is Antiochus Epiphanes' predecessor. Then verse 21 is Antiochus Epiphanes himself. But a lot of this, and the reason I believe Daniel goes into this detail about each of these, is all of this is setting the tone for what's going to happen in the tribulation period. Now, verse 22 says, and the overflowing forces will be flooded away from him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. And after an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception and will go up and gain power with a small force of people. Now,
who is being referred to as the prince of the covenant?
Antiochus Epiphanes.
Okay.
Now, the interesting thing here is, notice it says that after an alliance is made with him. And again, I don't want to get into detail at this point about which one is which and who made the covenant with this guy and who did this, because I'm going to tell you, folks, it gets nitpicky and it gets confusing as to who did what. But what is important at this point is Antiochus Epiphanes ultimately came to power not by military force, but by threats and intimidation, and by arranging peace treaties and what have you. He finagled his way into authority and power, and it was a position that he was never well, basically was never his to be had. He was just a military leader that ascended to the throne through intrigue, which tells us if indeed he is the type or the model of the Antichrist, later on down the line, when the Antichrist does surface, the likelihood that he will be a military leader, pretty slim. He will become a military leader in the same sense. For example, right now, the President of the United States, is he or is he not a military leader?
Yes and no.
Yes.
Okay.
Technically, yes, but whether he's a good one or not.
Actually-
is another.
Actually, Sherry got the answer right. Yes and no. He is a civilian, but even as a civilian, he leads the military. He is the commander-in-chief. That is probably a good description of what the Antichrist is going to be. He will accede to power not by military might, but by political intrigue, by treaties, by being sneaky, by being in the right place at the right time. But then as the political leader, he will become a great military leader, and armies will follow him.
So verse 22 and 23 are basically foreshadowing of the Antichrist.
Absolutely. Although they at this point are specifically talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, what you see here, and again, just to reiterate, the reason Daniel is being so nitpicky about stuff that, happened, well, about 2,300 years ago, is because all of this is going to happen again. All right, verse 24 says, in a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. Now, what it says there is that he's going to come to power during a period of peace. In fact, that's exactly what Antiochus Epiphanes did. While he stirred up a lot of wars between him and Egypt and what have you, he was able to usurp authority over Palestine during an interval of peace by basically arranging a peace treaty. Well, how does that affect us for the future? At what point do we know the tribulation period is going to start?
When the peace treaty is signed.
There's a peace treaty, which will be signed by guess who? None other than the Antichrist. So you see, what the Bible tells us is going to happen in the tribulation, while it has not happened to that degree, it's happened before. Verse 25 says, he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. Now again, just a reminder, the king of the south was Egypt. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war, but he will not stand, for schemes that will be devised against him. Well, at this point, this is getting close to the time that back then the Roman army was beginning to take an interest in all of this. It said, and those who eat his choice food will destroy him. In other words, well, who eats the king's choice food?
Those closest to him.
The king's court.
There you go. So what this is telling us is that the king of the south at that point was actually betrayed by people within his own kingdom, his own court. It said his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, now this is interesting. Verse 27 tells us that what we're seeing going on in our nation today isn't anything new. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table. Where have we seen that before? When a bunch of politicians get together. How do you know when a politician's lying?
When his mouth's moving.
His mouth's moving. That's exactly what Daniel is saying here. Said these two guys, Antiochus and the king of the south, are going to get together. They're going to have a peace treaty with each other. They're going to talk peace, sit down at the table. And the whole time, that they were talking peace to each other, behind each other's back, they were trying to figure out how they're going to sink the knife into the other guy's back. Same thing the Antichrist is going to do. Then he will return to his land with much plunder. This is Antiochus Epiphanes, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. Now, what happened? That Antiochus Epiphanes marched against the king of Egypt with the intent of invading Egypt. They met each other under a flag of truce. That's actually what Daniel was talking about when he said they were going to talk lies to each other at the table. They met each other under a flag of truce. And while all that was going on and they were trying to talk peace with each other, a general from Rome showed up with a letter from the Roman Senate basically saying, and it was addressed to Antiochus, go home or we come against you. Because in the meantime, Egypt had been making an approach, sending their ambassador and what have you to Rome asking for help, and Rome decided that they would get involved in it, and so they sent their general to show up for all this, and the Roman general pretty much told Antiochus Epiphanes, go home or you're going to face our wrath. And Antiochus Epiphanes then tucked his tail, went back home. By the way, the story is, and of course Daniel doesn't go into this much detail, but we do know from historical records that this Roman general, as they were outside there in the northern Egyptian area, and which of course is very sandy and the edge of the desert, this Roman general had one of his servants, one of his soldiers, draw a large circle around Antiochus as they were speaking. The general then told him, before you step outside of this circle, you're going to make a decision as to which you're going to do. The general pretty much told him, you try to leave without giving me your answer, you'll die here in Egypt right now, right here, right now. And that apparently, according to the historians that gave an account of this, that he stood there fuming for several minutes, finally told the Romans, okay, you win, and then gave orders for his army to retreat. But he was so mad about it that he headed back north to Syria. And you'll notice that in verse 28, he says his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. Now keep in mind, Antiochus was from Syria. At this point, he's in northern Egypt threatening the Egyptians when he gets threatened by the Romans. Where's he got to go to get back home in Syria?
Through the Holy Land.
Through the Holy Land. And what he decided to do was he was so angered by all this, he knew he couldn't beat the Egyptians or the Romans. So guess who he takes it out on?
Israelis.
He takes it out on the Jews on his way through. Then that is when Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple in Jerusalem, basically just sets up shop in Jerusalem, puts a stop to temple worship, demands that all semblance of Israelite worship be brought to a halt, and that they would from now on worship me or you die.
So it was a temper tantrum.
It was a temper tantrum.
So Rome coming to the rescue of Egypt during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, were these events all contemporary with Cleopatra and Mark Antony, or did that happen later?
No, that was just about the same time.
Okay.
Cleopatra and Mark Antony is what prompted the Romans to get involved in it. This also, now I forgot what I was going to say.
Uh-oh.
I'm good at
I'm
sidetracking.
having an attack of OLD.
Early stages.
Well, hopefully it doesn't get any more advanced. Oh yeah, now I remember what I was going to tell you. That, of course, was the beginning of when Rome began to take an interest in all this. Now, what I'm about to tell you took place beginning then over about the next 3 years. But it ultimately ended up that now that the Roman army has taken an interest in this particular geographical area, and that the Jews, who later then, over the course of the following year, then began a rebellion against Antiochus Epiphanes because of what he was doing in Israel, they knew on their own the likelihood that they could defeat the Syrian army with Antiochus Epiphanes probably wasn't going to happen. Somebody, and we don't really know exactly who, but somebody else approached Rome for assistance to, well, if you Roman guys, you helped Egypt, can you come here and help us get rid of Antiochus Epiphanes? Well, guess what Rome's answer was?
Sure.
Sure! No problem. We'd be glad to come and help. And of course, we know what happened. Once the Roman army got there,
They don't leave.
they don't leave. And that's why when you go from Malachi to Matthew, and you open the book of Matthew and begin reading, lo and behold, you're in the middle of the Roman Empire. And a lot of people have wondered for years, how did this happen? When did the Romans show up? They'd only been there about 100 years by that point, and they got there because of what's called the Maccabean Revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes, and that problem started right here about verse 28. By the way, the time frame for all that was about 200 to 250 years before Christ. Verse 29 said, at the appointed time he will return and come into the south, but this time it will not turn out the way it did before. In other words, Antiochus Epiphanes had whipped Egypt once before. Didn't happen that way this time. Rome got involved in it. For ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the holy covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. In other words, what it said is that Antiochus Epiphanes demanded that temple worship come to a halt. He hated the Jews. And so any semblance of legitimate Jewish worship, he said, anybody caught doing that, you'll be executed. The only worship that's going to go on in this temple is worship of me. Well, now this reference to the ships of Kittim is rather telling because, first off, does anybody know the modern name for Kittim?
Cyprus.
That's Cyprus. Guess who had their fleet docked in Cyprus?
Mark Anthony?
Rome. So, yeah, well, okay, Mark Antony. Basically, the Roman fleet was docked at Cyprus. So when Daniel here makes a reference to the ships of Kittim, he's talking about the Roman Navy. And the Roman Navy got involved in all this. So that's why, again, Antiochus Epiphanes turned tail and ran, because not only has he got the Roman army after him, or potentially after him if he had decided to stand and fight, but the Roman Navy they're anchored just 100 miles or so off the coast of Israel, and the Roman Navy would have been sailing for the coast of Israel if he'd chosen to fight. Here's that Navy got involved in it again. Verse 31. And forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. There you have it, folks. That's how it all happened the first time. And by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant, but the people who know their God will display strength and take action. What happened is Antiochus Epiphanes sent his soldiers, he sent squads of soldiers around to every Jewish town. Everywhere there was a synagogue, he would call, or they would call together a town meeting. And the local citizens would be given a choice. You fall down and they carried with them a little portable idol. You fall down and worship this idol, which was, in some cases, it would be an idol to various, Roman gods, or it would be an idol of, not Roman gods, but the gods of the Syrians, or the Greeks. I meant. I'll get my tongue right in a minute. It was a statue to a Greek god. Sometimes it would be a statue of Antiochus himself, who demanded to be worshipped as a god. They would be given a choice. You fall down and worship this, you worship Antiochus, or you'll be executed right here, right now.
What a great choice.
Well, and quite a few Jews lost their heads at this particular point, because that was the preferred method of execution. Is the Greek guards basically would decapitate them right there on the spot. Now, that in itself is a model of what's to become. During the tribulation period, we're told, we haven't gotten this far in the book of Revelation yet, but in Revelation, when it says that those who refuse to accept the mark and who insist on accepting Christ, and they're caught, guess what the preferred method of execution during the tribulation period is going to be?
Beheading.
Beheading. Absolutely. Now, what happened is, in one particular town, there was a priest there named Mattathias. And finally, Mattathias had had enough. And he really wasn't the temple high priest, but he was the local priest there in that particular town. And he was going to capitulate and bow his knee and worship this idol. And Mattathias was one of the other priests in the town, and it so enraged him, he had a sword hidden under his cloak. And when his fellow priest got down on his knees before this guard and worshiped this idol, Mattathias pulled out his sword, executed him, and then before the little small squad of soldiers had a chance to react, he hacked them to death.
Oh my.
And then at that point, Mattathias turned and addressed the crowd and said, all of you here who are, for the covenant with God, follow me. He had 3 sons. I don't remember the names of all 3 of them, but the one that's important, his oldest son was named Judas. And so Judas, by the way, not everybody that was named Judas was a bad Judas. But he became known as Judas the Maccabean, or Judas Maccabee. And this is why his 3 brothers were all known as the Maccabees, and that's why this has become known as the Maccabean Revolution. For those of you who have a copy of the Apocrypha, and I'm not going to get into detail again as what that is, because I've described that about 3 or 4 times over the last several months, so you should remember. The Apocrypha has a 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees in it. While, again, we Baptists don't tend to accept that as inspired literature, if you have a copy of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees, it is a good, generally accurate historical reference that describes this Maccabean revolt. Well, Judas Maccabeus, as the leader of the rebellion, of course, his dad started it because that was Mattathias, but Mattathias is fairly elderly. And so his oldest son took up the reins and took up his dad's challenge to start the revolt. And they took off with as many as they could, headed for the hills, and then began rounding up faithful Jews to fight back. And that began the Maccabean revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes. Somewhere in the process is when they contacted Rome to ask for help. Well, when Antiochus Epiphanes, faced with this revolt and then found out that Rome was on the way, before he got caught, he took off and headed north. It is known for a fact that he never did get caught. He took off back to what had been known as Assyria, and then died later of, basically went mad and died of various diseases and mental illness. But they got rid of him. After, guess how long?
3.5 years.
3.5 years. Isn't it interesting how that worked out that way?
Just a coincidence.
Just a coincidence. 3.5 years. And that's what, in verse 32, that's what Daniel's talking about when he said the people who know their God will display strength and take action. That was fulfilled with Mattathias and the Maccabeans. Verse 33, and those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. In other words, they started a revolt, and some of them died. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. So in other words, what it says there is their little help. There were others that joined with them in the revolt. They had Rome on the way. But there were some, the reference to hypocrisy, there were some who had actually joined, and the little quotes, joined the revolt simply so that they wouldn't be in trouble with the faithful Jews, but they had already shown their true colors by worshiping these false gods. Verse 35, we'll finish up with that. And some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. In other words, Daniel's making one little reference here to what he's about to start, because beginning in verse 36, he starts talking about the appointed time, which is not then, but the future fulfillment of all of this. And the reference to being refined, of course, in order to bring the Jews back into true worship, to get rid of all of these false gods, to get the Jews on fire for God again, God allowed all this to happen. And a lot of them got killed as a result of it. But what it accomplished was it got those who were faithful, once again, it got them on fire for God. So the Jews in that respect weren't a whole lot different than the church is today. Because what happens to Christians when, and we see it in our own nation, when we experience a time of prosperity and we're not under persecution, what has tended to happen to the church over the centuries?
Becomes complacent.
We get complacent and lazy. But when we're under persecution, we get on fire. Personally, I think that's one of the reasons God is allowing some of the things that are going on in our nation to happen today, because for the first time in the last 100 years, the church is starting to get serious again.
That's sad that it has to go that way.
Yep.
Human nature.
All things work together.
Yep. All right. On Sunday night, we pick up with verse 36, and we're going to go down, if we can get that far, we're going to go down through chapter 12, verse 4 on Sunday. Questions this evening? All right, one last point. Beginning in verse 36. What I've given you up until now has been an overview of all of these squabblings and wars and stuff going back and forth that was fulfilled in the 2nd and 3rd century BC with Antiochus Epiphanes. Beginning in verse 36, at that point Daniel jumps forward and begins to describe why the first half of chapter 11 was important, because beginning in verse 36, he now starts talking about not Antiochus Epiphanes, but the real Antichrist. All right. Lou, would you lead us in a benediction?